Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of the second episode of Season 2, which to my surprise turned out to be kind of decent, at least toward the end. In the beginning it did kind of annoyed me because of some silly stuff they showed, but toward the end it actually had some good dialogue, and it did make the effort to make the kind of Star Trek episode that I was constantly begging for in the recent years, to actually do some morality tale, some educational messages, all the kind of stuff that was missing from the recent Star Trek shows in the last few years. And so finally, at least they made the effort to do such a story. I also appreciated the attention to detail with the costumes and how everything looked like those court scenes in TOS, while at the same time looking good and futuristic, but also faithful to the original series. And they even avoided showing some of the things that annoyed me, like when they showed San Francisco, they kept showing the bridge from the side and not from above, and so we did not see any solar panels on the bridge, which is something I was constantly complaining about anytime they showed it, because of how stupid it was. Because why the hell would they need solar panels when they have stuff like fusion reactors? And when you have space stations in orbit, if you do want to collect solar energy, why not do it in space and then transmit it down to the planet? So it made absolutely no sense, especially putting it on a bridge which can be used for walking. I guess the idea was that with transporters everywhere, people no longer walk from place to place. But wouldn't some people want to do it for enjoyment purposes? And we did see that in the older Star Trek shows, like in the final episode of Voyager, we saw people standing on that bridge looking at Voyager, and there seemed to be a train or something on the bridge. And so I always complained how stupid it was that in Discovery and in Picard they showed as if the bridge is entirely covered by solar panels. And so finally, when they showed the bridge in this scene, they showed it from the side, from a distance, and we did not see any solar panels. I do think it was intentional, because I do get the sense that they are finally listening to the fan complaints. I was also happy to see them use actual paper books in those court scenes, because that's what was used in TOS. In those kinds of scenes, they were always using actual physical books. And it's also kind of a continuity issue with Discovery, because I remember when Tilly saw that Michael had a real paper book, she was so amazed by it, she was so astonished, as if it's the first time in her life she sees an actual paper book. And I guess I can explain it away by saying maybe in settings such as a court, they do use real books as kind of a ceremonial thing, like it's more honorable to show the actual physical book. And so these are the minor things which I kind of liked in this episode, the fact that it fits with TOS so well. We also had that little glowing thing they put their hand on, which they never said anything about it in this episode, but it's implied it's a lie detector, which is not such a bad idea in my opinion. The problem would be, if you're not telling the full truth, if you're in some gray area between fact and fiction, if your memory is faulty, and all kinds of situations like that, in which it will beg the question, how exactly will this device determine what is true or not in all kinds of situations like that, or if it's possible to cheat it somehow. So I guess we can leave these questions to another time. Overall, I did like how everything looked like. What did annoy me was mostly in the beginning of the episode, when Pike goes to that Illyrian planet, on which conditions are not fitted for humans. Illyrians apparently genetically engineer themselves to fit whatever planet they're on, which is also an interesting idea. I wish they would have explored more. If that's the nature of their genetic engineering, then what's so wrong about that exactly? They never really dealt with the issue itself. Is genetic engineering always evil, or are there circumstances in which it's perfectly logical? So they never really discussed the issue itself, which was disappointing in this episode. So he goes to this planet and he's wearing a cheap looking oxygen mask, which is not enough for him. He can barely walk on the streets. And it's kind of silly, because previously we've seen much better oxygen masks and spacesuits, and so why did he bring such a poor one? Maybe it was deliberate as part of the trick that he does later, because when he gets to the office of that lawyer and they don't want to accept him, he, I guess, deliberately suffocates himself. He has only 2% oxygen left, and yet he keeps waiting. So I guess maybe he deliberately brought such a poor mask with him to make this scene possible. It's kind of silly to me, because it's almost like a kid holding his breath so that his demands will be met. And so he deliberately suffocates himself in front of these people so that they will surrender to his wishes. And I guess he knows he will not die, because, he saw his own future. He knows he will end up in that chair, so he knows nothing bad will happen to him. So maybe that's why he take all these risks. which is also a problem later on in this episode when his career is threatened and all of that. And I kept thinking that because he knows his future, that he's going to be in Starfleet in that accident and is going to end up in that wheelchair, and so he must feel totally safe at all times that his career will not be harmed. And so maybe that's why he's willing to take all these risks, because he knows nothing can possibly happen to him. So anyway, as he begins to suffocate, that lawyer agrees to meet with him finally, and then we see that it's the best lawyer in the galaxy. And then we have a scene of Pike literally apologizing to her, saying the Federation is wrong about Illyrians, and I was wrong, and he's kind of almost bowing down to her and apologizing to her. And that gave me those woke vibes, just like in Picard, when Picard kept apologizing to Raffi and to everyone for things he was not guilty of, because he's so privileged, and so he has to apologize to her. And then she literally says that the Federation has draconian race laws, that they're discriminating against the Illyrians because they're genetically engineered and all of that. And that's another problem in this episode, that it once again made the Federation and Starfleet seem extremely evil. And so it completely destroys the whole utopian idea that the Federation is this masterpiece society in which all such problems have been solved. And I know that even in the old Star Trek shows, it was always a problem that on the one hand, they keep saying how great the Federation and Starfleet is. On the other hand, we see actual stories that shows the opposite. And it was the problem even in the older shows, I do admit that. And so I cannot blame only the new shows for doing that. But simply it's the weight of all of it put together. Like each time they show another example of that, it makes it even more laughable to say that the Federation is an utopia when obviously it's not. Overall, I do think the older shows did it better simply because they always had it to be some alien civilization which was having those kinds of difficulties, and our heroes simply helped those civilizations out. And if there was some court situation, it was on some other alien planet and not part of the Federation. And yet, recently, it's more and more about the Federation itself, which also apparently is still evil and racist and discriminating and all of those things. And so it makes it more and more laughable that the Federation is supposed to be an utopia. And also the way they show the court proceedings themselves are also kind of silly, but I guess we can explain it by saying that in the future the judicial system is simply so different from today, and so we cannot judge it by today's standards. But shouldn't it get better and more logical and more enlightened in the future? And yet apparently it's the opposite. But again, that's a problem that was always in all the Star Trek shows. And obviously it all has to be shortened for a TV episode, and so we cannot see an actual court case as it would be like in real life, so I'm willing to ignore those kinds of details. And at some point they have Admiral April on the stand, and then this lawyer starts attacking him for violating the Prime Directive, which I found funny because that's also an issue that's been talked about so many times, that on the one hand it's their most important law, and on the other hand they keep violating it at every opportunity. So why not just change the law? If the law itself is obviously ignored on so many occasions in which the situation calls for it and Starfleet seems to be fine with it, then why not change the law itself, or simply call it the Prime Advice and not the Prime Directive? Since so many times, so many captains apparently violated it without any consequences, Starfleet is fine with it, so it's not technically a law if it can be violated by a captain's discretion, and it's totally fine. So that's another problem that keeps accumulating with so many examples that it becomes kind of ridiculous over time. Also, there was a slight continuity issue when they mentioned the eugenics wars, and they said that it killed tens of millions of people, which does fit the original TOS dialogue about the eugenics wars, and also in Star Trek Enterprise they also gave the figure 30 million deaths. And yet in this show, in season 1, when they mentioned the eugenics wars previously, they directly said that it was also called World War III, which killed 600 million people, as was mentioned in Star Trek First Contact and also in Star Trek Discovery. And in this show they said that it killed 600 million, and so according to Pike in season 1 it was the same war as the eugenics war, and yet now they say it killed tens of millions of people, and so they cannot seem to make up their mind about how many people died in that war exactly. I know it's been a continuity issue ever since TOS, because they originally said that war was in the 1990s, and yet later in Voyager, when they went back to the 1990s, there was no sign of any such war taking place, and also Spock said it was the last of the world wars, and yet in First Contact we were told that it happened in 2050 something. And I guess in season 2 of Star Trek Picard, they kind of tried to fix those continuity issues when Picard said that the history of the 21st century is all messed up because so many of the records were destroyed and all of that. So I guess we can come up with excuses for all these continuity issues, but shouldn't they at least try to keep it consistent inside of this show, to keep all these facts the same every time they mention eugenics wars? They cannot keep saying a different number every time they talk about it. And also they have this character of Noonien Singh on the crew, and yet at no time in the court scenes were they actually discussing her. How come she's allowed in Starfleet when she is descended from augmented people apparently, and that's perfectly fine, and yet an alien who have been practicing genetic engineering on a different planet, that's somehow wrong. And so they never actually discuss the issue itself. They only talk about, discrimination, how Una was seeking asylum, and all of that is fine. I liked that bit of dialogue toward the end of the episode. That's what saved the episode, in my opinion, because the dialogue toward the end was actually strong and good. But they didn't really discuss the issue itself, and this is supposed to be a science fiction show, and yet they barely discussed the issue of genetic engineering itself. And that's why this episode ultimately is not as good as episodes such as The Measure of a Man, which was also a court drama episode, but it also dealt with a science fiction topic of whether or not artificial intelligence should be considered as actual sentience and self-awareness. Is Data actually a person with a soul who deserves the same rights and all of that? Obviously, it's not the same issue here. Obviously, no one is arguing that Una is not sentient or anything like that. But they are arguing over the legality of genetic engineering and all of that, and yet they never really dealt with the issue itself, unfortunately. And so I felt it was a bit of a missed opportunity. And also I thought it was a missed opportunity not to fix some of the continuity issues we had between TNG and Deep Space Nine. Because, in Deep Space Nine, when they mentioned how genetically engineered people are not allowed in Starfleet and it's illegal to genetically engineer people, it was kind of a continuity mistake with TNG, because back in TNG they never mentioned that, because they met a colony of people who were genetically engineering themselves and they gave some of them asylum, and no one ever mentioned to those people, oh, by the way, if you do join the Federation, you wouldn't be allowed into certain professions, you wouldn't be allowed to be a doctor, you wouldn't be allowed to join Starfleet, because we actually consider genetic engineering illegal, and so you'll be like outcast inside the Federation, you will not be allowed into certain positions, and no one mentioned that to them, and so that's kind of a problem. And also back in season 2 of TNG, we saw the Darwin station on the planet Gagarin 4, which was apparently manned by humans, and they were doing genetic experiments and creating augmented children with superpowers, and no one in the whole episode mentioned that that's illegal. And so I wish they would have somehow explained it away, that maybe in certain areas of the Federation, on certain planets, there's an exception that people on those planets are allowed to do whatever they want. Maybe because they came from alien cultures in which it was okay before they joined the Federation, and so the Federation made some kind of an exception. Maybe that's what they should have done with these Illyrians in this show. If they were genetically engineering themselves before they ever joined the Federation, and if they're doing that simply to survive on alien planets, because apparently instead of terraforming planets, they're changing their own physiology to fit on that planet better, which, by the way, I don't think there's something wrong with that. Maybe this episode should have ended with the Federation making an exception for those people to be allowed to do those kinds of modifications, maybe only on their planets and not on other planets. Maybe in their own territory they will be allowed to do that, and then we can assume maybe the Darwin station we saw in TNG was in that territory, and that's why it was okay to do that in that area of space, even though they were part of the Federation apparently. And so I wish they would have done something like that to try to explain away those continuity issues. Maybe they'll do that later. And the episode ended with an exception being made only for Una, which begs the question, how come others from her people do not then seek similar treatment? If it's okay for her to be in Starfleet while being augmented, why it's not okay for others? And so doesn't this open the door for everyone? So it doesn't really make much sense if we actually think about it, because by the time of Deep Space Nine, a century later, it's still illegal and not allowed, and Bashir was almost kicked out of Starfleet when they found out he's genetically engineered. And so why was an exception made only for Una and not anyone else? What would happen if another one of her species asks for asylum officially and also asks to join Starfleet, will he be denied? And then he'll be able to point at her and say, if she was allowed in Starfleet and is serving in Starfleet without problems, why am I not allowed? And so it doesn't really make much sense if we think about it. And by the way, the name El-Irians is kind of similar to the El-Orians, who are Guinan species. And now I realize maybe that's why they didn't want to make that woman who we saw in the previous episode, who comes from some long-lived alien species. And I was saying in the previous review, why not just make her an El-Orian, since it's so similar anyway. And now I realize maybe it's because they already named Una's people the El-Irians, and so that will be too confusing if now we have El-Orians as well. And so maybe that's why they gave a different name to that woman's people, as not to make it too confusing. And maybe they should have used a different name for Una's people, especially since this name is also the name of those people we saw in Enterprise, the ones that Captain Archer robbed in the Delphic Expanse back in season 3 of Enterprise, which, by the way, they were never named in the dialogue of the episode itself. We never actually heard those aliens being named in the episode. It was only in the script, and so technically we can argue that those were not the same species. Also, they looked totally different. They have a strange forehead and did not look human, but we can explain that also by saying that because of the genetic modifications, that on different planets they look a bit different because they modified themselves to fit the environment, and so we can explain all of that away. So anyway, I do think maybe that's one of the reasons they did not want to use the name El-Orians for the name of that woman's species, because it will be too confusing with what they already did in season 1 with Una's people. And also, once again, we have an annoying Vulcan, which is also something that's been bugging me ever since Enterprise, that most Vulcans we see are apparently a-holes. Only Spock is a good Vulcan, and almost every other Vulcan we ever meet is always a bad guy. And that is starting to get annoying, especially because back in TNG it was mentioned that Vulcans are very honorable and enlightened people, and yet almost every Vulcan we see on screen is kind of evil. Why is it always an evil Vulcan man who is so toxic toward the women? And also there's a scene in which he apparently sexually harasses his subordinate, because remember that Vulcans, when they make love, they use only 2 fingers to touch each other and all of that. So for them, the act of touching with 2 fingers is extremely intimate, because they're so reserved, they're so that's the most they would ever do in public and all of that. And yet this Vulcan is using his 2 fingers to touch this woman beside him, and it was so strange because a Vulcan wouldn't do that in public, out in the open, in front of everyone. So that was extremely strange as well. And later on he also touches her shoulder and kind of pushes her down to sit as he takes command, because he wants to be more aggressive, and he starts to endanger Pike's career, and Pike looks worried. And that again is kind of a logical problem, because if Pike knows his future, that he's still in Starfleet when he has that accident, why is he so worried about his career when obviously his career cannot ever be in danger until he reaches that point when he has the accident? And that's one of the biggest problems in the show in general. I kept saying that from the beginning. Anytime he's in danger, he should know that he's totally safe, and his career is also totally safe. So there should be no sense of danger for him. And also Una also knows this. So why are they so worried about his career when they know for a fact it cannot possibly be in danger? And also it always annoys me if it pretends to be a direct prequel, that it will tie perfectly to the old show. How come they have so many continuity issues? For example, in this episode, we have a scene of Spock coming to Mabenga and telling him that that evil Vulcan is an associate of his father and that's why he dislikes him, something like that. And yet in the original Star Trek show, no one knew who Spock's father was. When Sarek came on the Enterprise as the Vulcan ambassador, no one in the crew had any idea it was Spock's father until he told them. And so obviously he does not discuss his family life with anyone on the ship. And yet here he does, and so it doesn't seem to fit. And so we have a bunch of issues like that in this entire series, and I'm betting we'll have a lot more of them. And so why pretend it's a direct prequel when obviously it cannot possibly fit? So they would have been better off to do what the 2009 movie did and simply say it's a different timeline and things don't have to line up perfectly. It would have been better for everyone. So to summarize this episode, it was obviously this show's attempt to make an episode such as The Drumhead or Measure of a Man and other court episodes from Star Trek, and it was relatively decent, but still not as good as those episodes I just mentioned. And ironically, as a kid, I kind of hated episodes like The Drumhead because I found them boring. You know, there was almost no action, no space adventure, and so as a kid I remember hating those episodes, but the ideas in those episodes kind of stuck in my head, and over time as I got older I realized those episodes were actually really good because they actually taught me something. They had some educational messages in them that kind of stuck with me and made me a better person and so on. And so over time I realized those were actually really good episodes because they actually taught me something. And when I think about this specific episode, I don't think it's as good as those old ones, because in the old shows they always use some science fiction idea as a metaphor to some real life issue, and doing it in a clever way that will make people think. Even someone who doesn't agree with the message, it will make him think about those issues and maybe change his mind and all of that. And yet in this episode they don't really dive into any deep philosophical question or any science fiction idea. They kind of directly just say, oh, discrimination is bad, racism is bad, and kind of deal with these issues the same way that a modern show will be able to do. So what's the point of using a science fiction setting to talk about things that exist today without using an actual metaphor? And so in that sense it's not as good as episodes like Measure of a Man or Drumhead, but at least it is an attempt to do that kind of story. And so there's basically no action scenes in this whole episode, and it's all just this courtroom drama. And some of the dialogue toward the end of the episode was kind of good, and that's why I do think that relatively it is a decent episode. And that whole dialogue by Una in the end, talking about her sad childhood, that she had to hide her being augmented, and how some boy was beaten up in school for being different and all of that, it reminded me of some of the dialogue in the TNG episode about the Genai, those genderless aliens, and how a boy was beaten in school because someone found out that he views himself as a male, and that's why she had to hide being a female all her life because of the fear of how she'll be treated. And so we had some similar stuff here. So I guess it's the usual trope of a Star Trek character, someone who joined Starfleet because he escaped some persecution on his home planet. But at least in the past it was always some alien planet outside of the Federation, so it kind of made sense that it's not part of the Utopia. And now it apparently all took place on a Federation planet because those people joined the Federation, and so they decided to abandon genetic engineering to fit with the Federation laws, and then started discriminating against some of their own people who were still practicing genetic engineering. And the Federation itself was completely ignorant of the fact that people are being oppressed on their own member planet who joined the Federation, so shouldn't they be against such practices? And so that's why it doesn't really make sense. If the Federation is an utopia, how come they're so blind to people being oppressed in their own territory? When it was some alien planet in a distance outside the Federation, then it made sense that they simply didn't know about it or had no jurisdiction there. But here it's about a planet who joined the Federation, who is now a part of the Federation, and yet people are being oppressed on that planet. And only now someone mentions that, oh, maybe we should ask for an asylum. How come no one else ever asked that from the Federation? And so it doesn't really make much sense, and it kind of destroys the whole vision of the Federation as an utopian society, which I admit was a problem in all the Star Trek shows, but now it's getting more and more ridiculous with all these numerous examples of people being oppressed inside the Federation itself and being mistreated by Starfleet itself. And with so many examples, it makes all of Starfleet and the Federation seem more like a dystopia than a utopia. And that's kind of a problem, in my opinion. But at least in the end, it was kind of optimistic that maybe things will change for the better, maybe things will improve. But again, in Deep Space Nine, a century later, it was still apparently the case that someone will get kicked out of Starfleet if he was genetically engineered, even against his will, even if it was when he was a child. But even then, in the end, Bashir was allowed to stay in Starfleet, and his father only got like a 2 year in prison, something like that, so like a slap on the wrist. And so I guess Starfleet and the Federation no longer have such draconian laws. It's no longer 20 years in prison, it's just 2 years in prison. So maybe over time, maybe when they jump to an even farther away future, maybe they will say that genetic engineering is now allowed, which I think will be more interesting for a science fiction show anyway. The only problem will be that just for a show, you need to have some stakes, you need to have some sense of danger. And so if your characters are overpowered with so many new abilities and they'll all be like Superman, then it will be a more boring show. And so that's the only problem I have with it. But in general, as a science fiction idea, I actually think genetic engineering should be legal. And so that's another problem I have with this whole storyline in Star Trek. So anyway, that's all I had to say about it for now. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.